When an elderly black woman was publicly humiliated in a supermarket, she silently swallowed the insult. But no one knew that in just a week, she would own that very store and fire every single person who had treated her as a nobody. Her decision would shock even those who had seen it all. But let's go back to the beginning. Margaret Johnson woke up at dawn, as always, without an alarm clock. In her hands was the usual cup of coffee that gave her the boost she needed before her workday. At 72 years old, she still worked as a cleaner, not because she had to, but out of habit. Her neighbors were often amazed at her persistence, but Margaret couldn't imagine her life without work. Every day started the same. She would tidy up the local supermarket, where she had been working for 20 years. It seemed like just another ordinary day. After finishing her morning shift, Margaret decided to buy a few groceries before heading home. She carefully placed everything in her basket and went to the checkout, where a young man, always polite and smiling, greeted her. At that moment, the store manager, a tall, smug man named Harry, emerged from the back room. His sharp gaze fell on Margaret, and his face twisted into a scornful grimace. "Here you are again, Miss Johnson," Harry said loudly, folding his arms across his chest. "I hope you cleaned properly this time. Last time it seemed like you thought we were paying you to take a break." Margaret froze, her heart pounding. Customers in the line behind her threw curious and embarrassed glances her way. She knew Harry had a bias against her, not just because of her age, but because of her race. His harsh, belittling tone was never directed at the other workers. "I always do my best, Mr. Harry," she quietly replied, trying to maintain her dignity. But Harry didn't stop. He apparently decided this was the perfect moment to humiliate her in front of everyone. "Having you work for us is like cleaning the floors with a dirty rag," he sneered. "How many times do I have to say we need young and energetic people, not someone like you who can barely move her feet?" Margaret felt her cheeks burn. She looked down at her basket, avoiding his gaze. She wanted to disappear, to become invisible like she often felt at work. But at that moment, she realized she could no longer tolerate such humiliation. Quietly, she took her groceries and without another word, walked past the checkout. The customers stood in awkward silence. Harry, satisfied with his victory, simply smirked and went back to the stockroom, confident that this incident would pass without consequence. What he didn't know was that this scene was the final straw for Margaret, and she was no longer willing to endure such injustice. After the incident, Margaret felt defeated. She returned home to her usual surroundings, a cozy armchair by the window, a stack of old magazines on the coffee table, and pictures of her children and grandchildren on the walls. But this time, the familiar setting offered no comfort. Her mind replayed the scene in the store, Harry's cold eyes, his degrading words. She had always been a strong woman, accustomed to hardship, but this insult wasn't just personal. It was a reminder of the injustice she had faced her entire life. The next day, Margaret went to work as usual, but something had changed. Deep down, she knew she couldn't put up with this treatment anymore. Nevertheless, out of habit, she went to the store, trying to focus on her daily duties. But her inner conflict was evident to her grandson, Jason, who visited her that evening. "Grandma, what's wrong? You look upset," he asked, noticing her mood. Margaret tried to brush him off, but Jason insisted. He knew his grandmother was a strong woman, but something was different this time. After a few moments of silence, Margaret told him what had happened at the store. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a deep, suppressed hurt. "They always treat me like this. They think I'm worthless just because I'm old and black," she said bitterly. Jason, a lawyer who actively fought for the rights of people facing discrimination, immediately understood that this wasn't just a case of prejudice, but a clear act of racial discrimination. He suggested filing a complaint or a lawsuit against the store for racial discrimination, but Margaret, despite the pain and humiliation, refused. "I don't want a legal battle, Jason. I just want to be treated with respect," she replied. Jason, however, wasn't ready to give up. He began researching ways to help his grandmother and soon found an interesting piece of information. It turned out that the supermarket chain, of which this store was a part, was experiencing financial difficulties. This sparked an idea. If Margaret could invest her savings into purchasing shares, she could influence the store's fate, maybe even buy part of the business. "Grandma, have you ever thought about owning the store?" Jason asked with a smile. Margaret laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Jason was serious. He explained that with her savings and his connections, they could try to buy a significant share of the company's stock. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous to Margaret. How could she, a simple cleaner, become the owner of a store? But the more she thought about it, the more she liked the idea. The week that followed was filled with tense discussions and paperwork. Jason handled the negotiations meticulously, and in the end, he was able to arrange a deal that made Margaret a co-owner of the supermarket chain. This decision transformed her life, giving her the strength to look at things differently. She was no longer just a cleaner. She was the owner of the store, with every right to demand respect. Everything happened quickly and unexpectedly for the store. No one, including Harry, had any idea that the woman he had publicly insulted had now become his boss. The morning after the deal was finalized, Margaret put on her best dress, smoothed her gray hair, and confidently left the house. Today was a special day. At the supermarket where she had worked for so many years, no one knew what was about to happen. Accompanied by Jason, she walked into the store. Everything was as usual. Customers shopping, employees bustling about, and Harry standing by the checkout, loudly talking to a colleague, oblivious to their approach. Margaret calmly made her way to the employee section, where a few staff members nodded to her, but didn't think much of her presence. No one suspected that something significant was about to be announced. A few minutes later, a representative from the management company, a businesslike man in a formal suit, arrived. He approached Harry and began quietly discussing something with him. After a moment, Harry noticed Margaret and frowned, as if seeing someone he least expected. He walked over and asked, "Are you here for something? We don't need you for cleaning anymore." "Not that we ever did," he sneered. Margaret simply smiled quietly and nodded to Jason. Jason calmly walked up to Harry and said, "You're fired." Harry froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. He looked around, as if expecting this to be some kind of joke. However, the representative from the management company handed him documents confirming that Margaret was now a co-owner of the store and had the authority to make personnel decisions. "Is this some kind of joke?" Harry muttered in disbelief, looking from the papers to Margaret. "No, Mr. Harry," Margaret replied calmly. "I now own this store, and I will no longer tolerate disrespect or racism within these walls. You are fired for your actions." Harry turned pale. He tried to protest, but the words got stuck in his throat. Margaret continued to look at him, her face calm and dignified. Staff members began gathering around, watching the scene in shock. They whispered among themselves, unsure of what was happening. "You no longer work here," Margaret repeated, handing the decision over to the company's representative. "I'm sure we'll find someone who can do your job with much more respect for others." Harry slowly gathered his things and left without saying another word. The entire store was silent as he walked out. Customers and employees watched the moment, not fully grasping the magnitude of what had just happened. Margaret, feeling a surge of strength, turned to the remaining employees. "There will be changes in our store," she said. "From now on, everyone will be treated with respect, no matter who you are or what job you do." Her words were met with silence, but a subtle shift in mood was palpable. People began to realize that things were going to be different now. From that day on, everyone remembered it as the day the store changed, not just on the outside, but within. After Harry's dismissal, the atmosphere in the store began to change. Employees who had grown accustomed to his harsh and often unfair management style didn't immediately realize that things were now different. But Margaret's actions were clear and decisive. She appointed a temporary manager, a young woman named Catherine, whom she had long respected for her hard work and fair treatment of employees. Catherine knew the store inside and out, and Margaret fully trusted her. The first thing Catherine did under Margaret's leadership was to gather all the employees for a meeting. She spoke openly about how the store would now be run with respect for every individual, and that discrimination and humiliation would no longer be tolerated. Margaret also took the floor. "I've worked here for many years," she began, "and I know what it's like to be underestimated. That won't happen anymore. We're here to make this place better, both for us and for our customers." Margaret's words were powerful, and many employees felt inspired. People who had once felt insignificant now realized their work was valued. This marked a new chapter in the store's life, where every person mattered. Soon, a story appeared in the local news about how an elderly woman, who had been insulted at her workplace for years, became the owner of the store and radically changed its policies. The story created a huge buzz. Local residents began visiting the store not only for shopping, but also to see the legendary Margaret Johnson, the woman who had made a dream of justice come true. The influx of customers grew, leading to a significant increase in sales. People noticed the changes. Employees' smiles, the warm atmosphere, and the absence of tension made the store a more welcoming place. Margaret watched as the store, once a place of suffering for her, became a hub of positive change. Meanwhile, Harry, disgraced and unemployed, struggled to find a new job. His reputation had already spread throughout the town. Many employers knew of his prejudice and didn't want to associate with someone whose career had ended in such a scandal. Months passed and the store continued to thrive. But for Margaret, the real victory wasn't just the improved business. It was proving that even those who are underestimated can be stronger than anyone imagined. Her actions inspired others in her community to stand up for their rights and refuse to tolerate injustice. The final note of this story came when the supermarket chain's executives offered Margaret a position on the board of directors. Her experience, vision, and determination were recognized at the highest level. Now, she not only managed the store, but also influenced the company's policies, implementing changes that helped thousands of workers feel protected and respected. Margaret sat in her favorite chair by the window, holding a cup of coffee, just like she had many years ago. But now, her life was different. She smiled, thinking about how one small but very important step had changed everything.